In the village of Kimbala, a small, vibrant place surrounded by sunset gold mountains, the Masquerade Festival was the most anticipated event of the year. The streets came alive with bright colors, ancient music, and the intoxicating aroma of local spices that mingled with the sweet smell of baobab flowers. The masks, each one more elaborate than the other, represented the history, culture, and essence of their creators. For young people, it was a chance to show their creativity and pride in tradition. However, for 16-year-old Zanille, this festival was a painful reminder of her difference. She also wore a mask, but hers was not adorned with pearls or painted with ancient symbols. It was simple, gray, and rigid, reflecting a shield she created against the world. Since she was little, Zanille has carried the weight of the cruel words she heard. "Your face looks like a puzzle that no one wants to put together," a boy had once said, laughing alongside other classmates. That day, she ran home, feeling her face burning, not from the heat of the sun, but from the tears she couldn't contain. It was then that he decided never to show his face again. Her mother, Aminata, worried, tried to convince her that it was unnecessary, that her beauty was in her essence. But to Zanille, her mother's words sounded like an attempt at comfort that did not reflect the truth. While the other young people of Kimbala prepared their masks for the festival, painting them vibrant colors and adding details with beads and feathers, Zanille simply polished hers, trying to make it even more impenetrable. She walked through the village streets like a shadow among the lights, receiving curious and, at times, mocking looks. During the festival's round dance, the drums echoed in such a contagious rhythm that it seemed impossible not to move. But Zanille remained static, as if her emotions were as trapped as her face. That was when a voice cut through the sound of the drums. "Zanille, your mask doesn't match the party. It matches the fear." Laughter erupted, and all eyes turned to her. Zanille felt the ground disappear, but she maintained her posture, while inside her tears burned. Behind the mask, he bit his lip to keep from making any sound that might reveal his pain. Between the laughs, there was a different look. Tendai, a young man known for his calmness and wisdom beyond his years, watched the scene intently. He didn't just see Zanille's mask, but the way she held her shaking hands behind her back, as if trying to protect herself. He realized there was a story there, one that no one else seemed interested in hearing. With steady steps, he walked towards her, ignoring the curious glances around him. When he stopped next to her, he didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, as if he wanted to share the weight of that moment. "You don't need to listen to these people," he said after a while, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Zanille turned her head toward him, but didn't respond. His mask did the job of hiding his expression, but his eyes, which could be seen through the slits, were filled with confusion and disbelief. "They only see what they want to see," Tendai continued, "but I think you have something worth showing. You just need to decide when." He then took out a small hibiscus flower from his pocket, handing it to Zanille. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. In Kimbala culture, the hibiscus was a symbol of courage and resilience. Zanille didn't respond. He just held the flower, feeling the crowd's eyes move away as the drums started again. Tendai remained by her side for a few more minutes, as if to say that she was not alone, even without words. When he finally pulled away, Zanille felt something different. It wasn't exactly comfort, but a small fragment of curiosity about that boy's intentions. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone saw her beyond the mask. As the festival continued, Zanille's mind was torn between the present and painful memories of the past. She remembered how, as a child, she used to run through the streets without worrying about her appearance, until the day the bullying started. Each cruel comment was like a stone thrown at her self-esteem, building the invisible wall that now separated her from the world. However, Tendai's words seemed to echo, challenging the old voices in his mind. Could it be possible that he was right? That she could be seen in a different way? As the night progressed and Kimbala's sky filled with stars, Zanille continued to stand on the sidelines of the celebration, watching from afar. But the hibiscus flower in her hands was a constant reminder that maybe, just maybe, there was room for something new in her life. Tendai's words continued to reverberate in her mind, planting the seed of doubt that, for Zanil, was as frightening as it was hopeful. What if he's right? What if I have something to show? These questions were beginning to germinate, even against his will, preparing the ground for what was to come. Tendai was one of those rare young people who were not carried away by superficialities or appearances. Growing up in a family that valued stories and life lessons passed down from generation to generation, he had learned from an early age to see beyond what the eyes saw. For him, Kimbala masks were not just decorated pieces of wood, fabric, or clay, but a reflection of the soul of those who created and wore them. Therefore, when he saw Zanil isolated, with her unadorned gray mask, something inside him awakened. That mask didn't seem filled with pride or tradition, but with fear and silence. He felt there was a story there, one that no one had yet bothered to know. With firm but careful steps, Tendai approached Zanil in the middle of the dance circle. The sound of drums echoed like the beating of a gigantic heart, and people around them laughed and spun to the infectious rhythm. Zanil, however, was motionless, a statue in the midst of the energy storm. "Why don't you dance with us?" he asked with a smile that seemed to disarm any resistance. "I know the music is asking for it." For a brief moment, Zanil looked at him, but then looked away. The answer came quickly, dryly, almost like a reflex. "I dance better alone." Tendai was not offended. He realized it wasn't a personal rejection, but an attempt by her to build yet another wall around herself. Instead of insisting, he reached out and offered a hibiscus flower. "This is for you." The hibiscus is a symbol of courage, and courage is something we all need sometimes. Zanil hesitated before accepting the flower. Her gesture was cautious, almost as if she feared that the simple action of taking that gift might reveal more than she wanted. As she held the flower, she felt a strange mix of curiosity and discomfort. Tendai didn't say anything else at that moment. He just smiled again and returned to the dance circle, leaving Zanil to her own thoughts. That intrigued her. Why had he cared? Why would someone like him, so full of life and confidence, have noticed her? Over the next few days, Tendai found ways to get closer to Zanil without being invasive. He greeted her with a smile whenever he saw her, made little comments about the weather or village events, and occasionally left hibiscus flowers near the place where she used to sit alone. Zanil tried to ignore him, but Tendai's constant and discreet presence began to affect her. "I wasn't used to genuine kindness." To her, every act of kindness seemed to hide an ulterior motive, a trap waiting to reveal itself. In one of these chance encounters, Tendai finally decided to ask the question that had intrigued him since the beginning. "Why do you wear that mask all the time?" Zanil, who was distractedly looking at the horizon, froze for an instant. His fingers instinctively tightened the edges of the mask, as if he feared it might suddenly fall off. "Because it's easier to hide than to face the truth," she replied, her voice low and filled with a pain that seemed as old as herself. Tendai, however, did not back down. He waited a moment before responding, his tone as calm as the breeze that rustled the leaves of the surrounding trees. "Maybe the truth you fear is more beautiful than you think." Those words echoed in Zanil's mind for days. They were simple, but they carried a weight that she didn't know how to deal with. Zanil was used to hearing criticism, insults, and mockery. But hearing something positive, especially something so deeply personal, was disconcerting new. She wanted to believe in Tendai, but the fear of being humiliated again was a constant shadow that followed her. Whenever she began to allow herself to think that he might be right, memories of cruel laughter and scornful looks invaded her mind, bringing her back to reality. Tendai, on the other hand, did not give up. He understood that gaining Zanil's trust would be a long process, but he was willing to wait. Something in her eyes, in the way she held the hibiscus flowers so carefully, told him it was worth it. Another time, as they walked through the village market, he tried again. "Did you know that each mask tells a story?" he asked casually. Zanil just shook her head, not looking at him. Tendai continued, with a calm tone. "I think your mask might have one of the most interesting stories of all. I would like to hear it someday." Zanil didn't respond, but something in her posture changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Tendai noticed it. It was as if, for the first time, her wall had a small crack. The interactions between the two began to attract curious looks in the village. Some people laughed, thinking that Tendai was wasting his time. Others said he was just naive. But for Tendai, that didn't matter. He saw something in Zanil that no one else seemed to see. And although she was still cautious, he felt that, little by little, he was making progress. Even when Zanil tried to push him away with short answers or prolonged silence, Tendai remained. He knew that sometimes all someone needs is an outstretched hand to start believing that there is another way to live. And he was determined to be that hand for Zanil. Kimbala's school was a microcosm of conflicting energies, where dreams and insecurities coexisted in every hallway. For Zanil, that environment was more of an arena than a learning space. The whispers and hushed laughter that followed her were always present, as familiar as the sound of the bells marking the start of classes. However, that week, the bullying had reached a new level. During a meeting to organize the school's cultural activity, in which students were supposed to create and present their own masks, a group of classmates had the idea of turning Zanil into the center of a public joke. "Since you wear a mask every day, you must be the expert on the subject," shouted Lemba, a boy who always led the provocations. Laughter erupted all around, and before Zanil could refuse, her name was already on the list of participants. The weight of the inscription seemed to crush her more with each passing day. Zanil tried to speak to the teacher, asking to be removed from the event, but the request was met with a disappointed look. "Zanil, this is an opportunity to show your creativity. Don't you want to share your story with the world?" said the teacher, not realizing the depth of the girl's discomfort. The sentence, which should have sounded encouraging, only reinforced Zanil's fear. Sharing her story was exactly what she didn't want to do. On the morning of the event, Zanil could barely breathe. The auditorium was decorated with colorful fabrics, and the aroma of local flowers mixed with the smell of fresh paint from the masks. The other students proudly displayed their creations. Masks with feathers, shiny stones, and vibrant colors reflected the diversity of Kimbala. Meanwhile, Zanil remained on the side of the stage, holding her gray mask with shaking hands. It was a simple piece, without ornaments or details. And for her, it represented everything she always wanted to hide. The laughter in the background was like knives cutting through his already fragile confidence. "Will her mask be as boring as the one she wears every day?" whispered a voice in the crowd. Zanil felt her cheeks burn beneath her mask, but she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, trying to become invisible. The sound of laughter seemed to grow louder, echoing in his mind like a constant reminder of all the humiliations he had already faced. Every minute felt like an endless nightmare. It was at that moment that Tendai appeared at his side. He had noticed the tension in Zanil since the beginning of the event and knew he needed to do something. Without announcing his arrival, he approached and spoke in a calm but firm tone. "Zanil, you don't need to do this to please anyone. But if you do it for yourself." His words cut through the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in your head. She looked at him, her eyes meeting his behind a mask. Tendai held his hand, a simple gesture, but full of meaning. "You are much stronger than you think," he added, with a smile that seemed to light up the darkness around her. For a brief moment, Zanil felt a spark of courage ignite within her, but the fear was even greater. She shook her head slowly and replied, almost in a whisper, "I can't, Tendai. They will laugh at me. That's what they always do." Tendai lightly squeezed her hand, as if he wanted to transfer some of his trust to her. "If they laugh, it just shows how small they are. But you're bigger than all that." As the minutes dragged by, Zanil watched the other students take the stage, each receiving applause and praise. The master of ceremonies called out the next name on the list. Zanil Adebayo. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to her. Zanil felt like she was paralyzed, unable to move a muscle. Panic took over her body, like a chain that kept her locked in place. Tendai was still at his side, but now his presence seemed distant. "You can choose, Zanil. No one can force you to do anything." "But I believe in you," he said, his voice gentle but full of conviction. The seconds seemed to drag by as Zanil struggled with her own emotions. On one side, there was fear, as familiar and paralyzing as it had always been. On the other, there was something new. It wasn't exactly courage, but the seed of possibility, planted by Tendai's words and actions. But as much as I wanted to believe it, the weight of everyone's judgment still seemed unbearable. The master of ceremonies called his name again, this time with an impatient tone. Zanil took a deep breath, trying to find strength where there seemed to be none. And as the silence in the auditorium began to turn to murmurs, she knew that whatever choice she made in that moment would change everything. That afternoon, Kimbala's sun seemed softer, dyeing the sky a golden tone that was reflected in the leaves of the trees. Tendai and Zanil walked along a quiet trail outside the village, away from the hustle and bustle and curious eyes. Zanil kept her head down, as she always did, while Tendai talked about trivialities, trying to ease the visible weight on her shoulders. Zanil's silence, however, seemed more charged than usual. There was something about her that Tendai still didn't fully understand, but he knew that if he wanted to help her, he would need to give her time to decide to trust him. Suddenly, Zanil stopped. She held the hibiscus flower that Tendai had given her days before, twirling it between her fingers as if that small object held secrets she could not express. "I've never told anyone this," she began, her voice low and tentative, almost as if she was testing the words before blurting them out. Tendai turned to her, but said nothing, giving her space to continue. "When I was a child," she continued, her voice shaking slightly, "someone said my face was strange, that it looked like an incomplete puzzle. I was 7 years old. I didn't understand what that meant at the time, but the laughs were enough." Tendai remained silent, but the look in his eyes said it all. He was there, present, listening to every word without judgment. Zanil swallowed, taking a deep breath before continuing. "After that day, I could no longer look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. It was as if the reflection returned those words to me every time. That's when I started using the mask. At first, it was just a play to see if people stopped looking at me like that. But then it became a shield." She stopped, squeezing the flower tighter. "Now, I don't even know who I am without her." Tendai felt the weight of Zanil's every word. There was something deeply moving about her vulnerability, and he knew he needed to choose his next words carefully. "Whoever said that you didn't know what they were saying, Zanil," he replied softly. "These people just wanted to hurt you. Not because something was wrong with you, but because something was wrong with them. They couldn't see who you really are." He took a step closer, his voice taking on a firmer tone. "But I see, and what I see is someone stronger than they know. Someone who is still here, despite everything." Zanil looked away, but something in her face softened, as if Tendai's words had reached a place no one else had before. Still, the weight of fear and insecurity was difficult to shake. "Do you think it's that simple?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "It's not just about what people say. It's about what I see, and what I see is ugly." Tendai shook his head, his expression determined. "You are not what you see in the mirror, Zanil. You are much more than that. And maybe it's time to remember that." It was then that Tendai had an idea, something that seemed so simple, but at the same time, so bold. He smiled slightly, almost as if he was planning a mischief. "The festival is coming," he said. "What if, just for one night, you put the mask aside, not for them, but for yourself, to remember who you are, to show that none of this defines you?" Zanil looked up at him, surprised by the proposal. "Are you crazy? You would never do that." Her voice was firm, but there was a note of panic that revealed how far she was willing to go to avoid such a possibility. Tendai raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, but his smile remained. "It was just an idea. But think about it. Sometimes what we fear most is exactly what we need to face." He hoped the words would plant a seed, something that could grow over time. And although Zanil had vehemently denied it, something in his expression said that the idea had not been completely dismissed. As the two continued walking, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was as if something had changed, something subtle but significant. Maybe it was the beginning of a new perspective, or maybe it was just the effect of Tendai's words, still echoing in Zanil's mind. The festival arrived with all the splendor that Kambala could offer. The streets were filled with a pulsating energy, where the drum beats echoed like the heart of the village. The aroma of spices and the glow of handmade lanterns created a magical atmosphere. The masks, with their intricate designs, seemed to come to life in the hands of residents, each telling a unique story. For Zanil, however, the vibe of the party was not a reason for joy, but for growing nervousness. She watched everything from afar, the sound of celebration mixing with the chaos in her mind. Ever since the conversation with Tendai, his words kept echoing. What if, just for one night, she left the mask aside? The idea seemed as terrifying as it was liberating, but the fear was even stronger. As the night progressed, Tendai seemed to be everywhere. He laughed with the children, helped the elders adjust their masks, and danced with the infectious energy that only he possessed. But every now and then, his eyes looked for Zanil, who was standing on the edge of the crowd, like an isolated island in the middle of the ocean of colors and sounds. He knew that night could be a turning point, but only if she allowed it. As the traditional dance performance began, the audience gathered around the central stage, a raised space decorated with vibrant fabrics and flowers that exuded a sweet scent. Zanil stayed on the sidelines, away from the lights, trying to go unnoticed. Her heart was beating fast, as if anticipating something she couldn't yet name. Tendai took the stage together with a group of young dancers. He was known for his skill in rhythmic steps and the joy he conveyed as he moved. But that night, there was something different about his expression. After the first few minutes of the presentation, he did something unexpected. He stopped in the center of the stage and, with a smile that seemed to carry all the tranquility in the world, he looked directly at Zanil. "Zanil," he called, his voice clear and firm, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. All eyes turned to her, and an uneasy silence took over the space. Zanetta froze. Time seemed to slow down as the drum beats slowed down. Fear rose in his throat, making it difficult to even breathe. "Come," Tendai said, extending his hand toward her. "Trust in me." The words were like an electric current, coursing through every nerve in Zanil's body. She wanted to run away, disappear into the crowd, but something in Tendai's voice held her in place. People began to whisper, curious and confused. Each step Zanil took toward the stage felt heavier than the last, as if she were walking against the wind. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a drum out of tune. When he finally reached the stage, Zanil's trembling hands pressed against the sides of his clothes, as if holding on to the last bit of courage he had left. Tendai greeted her with a soft smile, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "You can do it. I'm here." The audience watched intently, a mixture of expectation and confusion hanging in the air. Tendai positioned himself next to Zanil, looking at her with an expression of unwavering confidence. He raised his hand slowly, but stopped before touching the mask. "Only if you allow it," he said, with a gentle tone that seemed to dismantle the barriers around her. Zanil took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of fear and shame pressing down on her shoulders. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but for the first time, they weren't from pain. She looked at Tendai, her gaze filled with hesitation and something else, a spark of courage that he had helped ignite. With a small nod, she gave her permission. Tendai moved his hands carefully, as if he were handling something sacred. When he removed the mask, the air seemed to stop for a moment. Zanil's face was revealed, a face marked by years of insecurity, but still filled with a beauty the world had not seen before. The silence in the audience was almost palpable, as if everyone was holding their breath at the same time. Then, like a wave that swells and explodes, the applause begins. First shy, then strong, accompanied by cries of support and encouragement. Zanil stood still, eyes wide as he looked at the crowd. The tears streaming down her face now carried something different: relief, surprise, and for the first time, acceptance. Tendai placed his hand on Zanil's shoulder, as if to remind her that he was still there. "You're amazing," he said, with a smile that conveyed both pride and happiness. Zanil looked at him, then at the audience, and something inside her began to change. The weight she had carried for so many years seemed to slowly dissolve, replaced by a lightness she almost didn't recognize. She still felt afraid, but now there was something stronger, a feeling that perhaps she could be seen for who she really was. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Zanil began to believe it too. The applause echoed through the festival like a rising tide, enveloping Zanil in a wave of emotions she could barely process. Each sound seemed to vibrate in his chest, as if this moment was not just a celebration, but a release. Zanil held the mask in his hands, his fingers touching the smooth, familiar surface that had, for so long, been his shield. But now, it seemed like a strange, almost irrelevant object. Tears streamed down her face, but for once, she didn't try to hide them. There was no reason for it anymore. What would once have been a source of shame was now just a natural response to a weight that had finally been lifted from her shoulders. People began to approach, some hesitantly, others enthusiastically. The crowd that had previously only watched her from afar was now there, close by, offering words that Zanil never imagined hearing. "You're beautiful, Zanil," said a woman, lightly touching her arm, as if to emphasize the sincerity in her voice. "Always has been," added a man next to her with a warm smile. Zanil looked at them without knowing what to say. His mind, used to rejecting praise and protecting itself from criticism, was now trying to adjust to this new reality. She still felt the internal resistance, a small voice that whispered doubts. But the warmth of the gestures and the truth in the eyes of the people around her began to silence that whisper. Tendai stood a little more distant at first, watching as Zanil navigated this moment. He knew this was her victory, not his, and that she needed space to take it all in. But when he realized that she was looking for him with her eyes, he approached calmly, his smile serene as always. He didn't say anything immediately, just opened his arms, inviting her into a hug that didn't need words. Zanil hesitated for a second, but then allowed him to wrap his arms around her. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. "You don't need that mask anymore," Tendai said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but firm enough to be heard over the surrounding noise. "Your true face is your best art." The words touched something deep in Zanil, something she still didn't know how to explain. For the first time, she believed it could be true. As the festival continued, Zanil felt something she had never experienced before: freedom. The air seemed lighter, the sounds more alive. Every step she took between the decorated tents and the lights of the lanterns seemed different, as if her feet were finally touching the ground for real, without the weight that always accompanied her. Some people continued to approach, offering words of encouragement or simply smiling. Others, those who had previously been part of the group that laughed at her, now looked at her from afar, some with obvious regret. Zanil didn't know how to react to these people, but for now, he decided not to carry any resentment. She no longer needed extra weight in her life. When he finally returned home, the silence in his room was comforting, a much-needed break after the intensity of that night. Zanil placed the mask on the table next to her bed, observing it as if for the first time. It was no longer a shield, but an object that now represented the past. She took a deep breath and approached the mirror. For a moment, he felt the familiar hesitation, the old instinct to look away. But this time, he forced himself to face his reflection. The face looking back at her was still the same. The little imperfections, the details she had always considered flaws, were still there. But something was different. His eyes were no longer filled with fear or shame. Instead, there was something new: strength, determination, and a spark of acceptance. In the days that followed, Zanil began to notice changes around her and within herself. At school, whispers had been replaced by greetings and smiles. Some people apologized, although most just changed their stance without addressing the past. Zanetta didn't cut it. What mattered was that she no longer had to avoid the hallways or classes. There was a new sense of belonging that she had never experienced before. At home, she began to allow herself small changes. I no longer wore a mask, not even when I went out. Every time she looked in the mirror, the reflection seemed less like an enemy and more like a part of herself that she was learning to accept. Tenai was still present, but never in an invasive way. He encouraged her with subtle gestures and words, always respecting her rhythm. In one of these conversations, he returned to what he had said at the festival. "Sometimes, we need someone to show us the truth that we can't see on our own," he repeated with a calm smile. Sunil watched him for a moment before responding. "I guess you were right," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. "But I think now I'm starting to see that truth for myself." Tendai just nodded, pleased to know that his words had made a difference. Over time, Sunil realized that he would still face challenges. The acceptance he felt now was real, but still new and fragile. There would be days when insecurities would come back, but she knew she wouldn't face these days alone. More importantly, I knew that now there was the tools to deal with them. Kimbala's sun was still born every morning, dyeing the sky with its golden tones. And while life followed her course, Sunil felt she was finally ready to accompany her. Not like the girl who was hiding behind a mask, but as someone who gradually began to accept and love who she really was. If you enjoyed this video, please help us grow by subscribing to this humble channel. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch.